partition previously, but also from economic, labour, social and cultural perspectives. 22nd of June 1921 was a day of pomp and ceremony, ushering in a new era in Ireland's history. Despite dire warnings, King George V and Queen Mary came to Belfast to officially open the new Parliament of the new entity, Northern Ireland. Belfast was draped with flags and bunting. Pavements and lampposts were painted red, white, and blue. And here are a number of images from that day. Despite the pageantry of the day, there was enormous security, with armed policemen placed in commandeered houses along the route. The opening of the Northern Ireland Parliament was boycotted by almost the entire Catholic community, with the Catholic Primate of Ireland, Cardinal Michael Logue, turning down an invitation to the open ceremony due to a prior engagement, as he said. To mark the occasion, the IRA attacked a troop train returning from the official opening of the Belfast Parliament, derailing it at Adavile on the Louth Armagh border. 4 men and 8 horses were killed. Northern Ireland faced significant political challenges from its birth. In the eyes of many on the island, including 1/3 of the population within its territory, it lacked legitimacy. Although by signing the Anglo-Irish Treaty in December 1921, Sinn Féin had formally accepted partition, the inclusion of Article 12 with its boundary commission gave hope to nationalists of the transfer of much of modern or Northern Territory to the Free State, leaving the remainder as an unviable rump. One of the objectives of the treaty, at least on the British side, was to normalise relations between both Irish jurisdictions. In many ways, the treaty led to the opposite. The Boundary Commission hung over Northern Ireland. Nationalists felt they could continue to ignore and obstruct the Northern jurisdiction, particularly in areas of nationalist majorities. It just added to the vulnerability and paranoia of the Unionists. The Northern Ireland Prime Minister, James Craig, stated as much to Winston Churchill in May 1922, claiming the Boundary Commission has been at the root of all evil. The prospect of some levels of cooperation evaporated, replaced by a siege mentality to protect the North's interests from the South and from those disloyal elements within its territory. The Northern government was allowed to take whatever measures it saw fit. In the Northern House of Commons, there was no opposition, with the Sinn Féin and Nationalist MPs abstaining from the Parliament. As the House of Commons elected the members of the Senate, there were only Unionist senators too. Other than providing financial support, the British government mainly adopted a laissez-faire approach, allowing the devolved Northern government to manage its own affairs unimpeded. The makeup of the cabinet of the first Northern government was also a significant factor in determining how the South and internal opposition was dealt with. All cabinet members were drawn from the upper layers of Protestant Ulster society, and all had close links with the Orange Order. The local elections of 1920 had been deeply embarrassing for the Unionists, losing many local authorities and seats to nationalists and the Labour movement. The Belfast Labour Party won 12 of the 60 seats in Belfast. The outgoing corporation of 52 Unionists and 8 nationalists yielded to a council of 37 Unionists, which included 6 Ulster Unionist Labour Association men, 12 Labour councillors, 1 independent Labour Unionist, 5 nationalists, and 5 Sinn Féiners. Labour formed the official opposition. Most nationalist-controlled local authorities within Northern Ireland chose a policy of non-recognition of the new jurisdiction. Both Fermanagh and Tyrone County Councils declared allegiance to Dáil Éireann on 28 November 1921. The Northern government suspended both councils, with the police taking over the headquarters in Omagh and Enniskillen and impounding their records. In total, 21 nationalist-controlled authorities, including those of Newry, Armagh, Strabane, Cookstown, Downpatrick, Matterfeld and Keady, were suspended by April 1922. Unionists west of the Bann River demanded further punishment. It led to some of the most significant decisions the government made that had long-term lasting repercussions. On top of suspending councils, it looked to take back control of them. It did this by abolishing proportional representation, PR, compelling councillors to pledge an oath of allegiance to the Crown, and gerrymandering regions to reduce radically the number of local councils held by nationalists. And here is a satirical cartoon of Craig explaining to a child saying, proportional representation, laddie, means confusion in Ulster. The abolition of PR for local elections and subsequently for parliamentary elections impacted most negatively on the Labour movement, with elections largely becoming sectarian headcounts on the legitimacy of Northern Ireland and the border. The Northern Ireland Labour Party took 3 of the 52 seats in the 1925 Northern Ireland general election under PR, and only 1 or 2 generally for the next 20 years once PR was abolished. It took none at all from 1949 to 1958. The removal of PR was followed by the rearrangement of local government boundaries. Unionist control of local and national government was consolidated by direct and indirect economic discrimination in employment, both in the public and private sectors, and in the distribution of public consumption benefits, especially public housing. The provisional government, the transitional government for the 26 counties, until the Irish Free State officially came into being on 6th of December 1922, led by Michael Collins, had the difficult task of trying to prevent a civil war within its own jurisdiction and react to conflict in the northern jurisdiction almost from the very moment of its inception. Collins, almost alone amongst the leadership of Sinn Féin, had come to accept the reality of partition and strove to do something to undermine it. The British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, complained to Churchill, "We could get Mr. Collins to talk about nothing else." He pursued a dangerous path of pursuing peace through pacts with James Craig in January and March of 1922, on the one hand, and sanctioning a policy of military activity along and across the border on the other. The pacts with Craig were in many ways a public front for Collins, who by his other actions sought to destabilise the northern jurisdiction. On top of arming the IRA for engagements in the north, Collins led a policy of non-recognition of the 6 counties, which caused deep frustration for the British and Northern Irish governments. One of the primary policies of non-recognition involved the payment of salaries of teachers based in Northern Ireland who refused to recognise 6 counties' Ministry of Education. The provisional government was also extremely tardy in transferring civil service personnel and files to Belfast. Collins met with opposition from within the provisional government for his policy on the north, and once he was killed in August 1922, a new policy prevailed to recognise the northern government and to discontinue the obstructionist policies. Leading the new initiative was Ernest Blythe, Minister for Local Government and an Ulster-born Protestant. The civil war in the south was a contributing factor in the delay of convening of the Boundary Commission, as was the non-cooperation of the northern government and several changes of government in Britain. The Free State government was the first to appoint its commissioner to the Boundary Commission, Eoin MacNeill, the Minister of Education, in July 1923. Almost a year later, in June 1924, the British government appointed the chairperson, Richard Feetham, a judge based in South Africa. With the Northern government refusing to appoint its commissioner, the British intervened by selecting Joseph R. Fisher. The commission met for the first time in November 1924. The work completed by the commission was not revealed for decades due to a leaking of the recommendations by the pro-unionist newspaper, The Morning Post, in November 1925. Much to the surprise of many nationalists, no large-scale transfers were on offer. In fact, a rich portion of East Donegal was to be transferred to the north. The leaked report recommended the shortening of the border by 50 miles, transferring 286 square miles to the south and 77 square miles to the north. The leak caused outrage in Dublin, leading to MacNeill resigning from the Commission, the Free State government, and even the Dáil, claiming as he departed that he wasn't the most suitable person to be a commissioner. Pleading ignorance of the Commission's findings, the President of the Free State Executive Council, W.T. Cosgrave, claimed it would be a farce and a travesty if the forecasts which had been published were correct. Realising the danger to crisis posed to the government, he dashed over to London to have the report shelved. James Craig suggested for the Free State to be relieved of part of the British national debt. The Free State government accepted Craig's suggestion, showing the extent to which the Free State government was prepared to purchase its own independence at the expense of Irish unity. The border remained as it is to the present day. Cosgrave was fooling few people by calling the agreement a damn good bargain. The Free State government and its Sinn Féin predecessor had failed politically just as it had militarily in preventing partition and unifying the island. Northern Ireland experienced very violent beginnings. Between 1920 and 1922, waves of violence encompassing many sectarian deaths engulfed the six counties. It is estimated that over 550 people were killed violently in the six counties in this period. Approximately 300 of the dead were Catholics, over 170 were Protestants, and over 80 were members of the security forces. Belfast accounted for the vast bulk of the deaths, with just under 460. Catholics, with one quarter of the population of Belfast, suffered over 70% of the deaths in the city. Catholic relief organisations estimated that 23,000 Catholics had been forced out of their homes and that about 500 Catholic owned businesses had been destroyed. Relief funds were also set up for unionists affected by the violence during this era. And here's an artist's impression of relief being offered to loyalists in Belfast. As the Government of Ireland bill was making its way through Parliament for much of 1920, tensions in Ulster started to boil over. Violence that started in Derry City soon moved further east. And here's some of the disturbances from Derry. Returning from the 12th of July holiday on the 21st of July, in Belfast, calls were made for the expulsion of all non-loyal workers from the shipyards. Straight afterwards, a mob went on a rampage, looking for potential victims. Some were stripped to their undergarments in a search for Catholic emblems such as rosary beads. Many were severely beaten. Catholics were soon expelled from many other companies in Belfast. It is estimated that a total of 10,000 men and 1,000 women workers were expelled, about 10% of the nationalist population of Belfast. Protestant socialists, known as the Rotten Prods, were also expelled from their jobs. The unrest travelled from the workplace to the streets of Belfast, resulting in 19 dead and many more wounded or homeless within 5 days. And here are some images from the violence that summer of 1920. Even though most of the violence was perpetrated against Catholics, Craig demanded that an Ulster Special Constabulary be established to just serve for the area that would become Northern Ireland. And even though the British government recognised that they could be accused of taking sides and ceasing to govern impartially, they granted Craig his Special Constabulary. The Ulster Special Constabulary came into existence on 1st November 1920 with an initial strength of 3,000 planned. Whilst hostilities ceased in the south after the truce on the 11th of July 1921, the birth of Northern Ireland in the summer of 1921 witnessed another wave of intense sectarian violence engulfing Belfast, resulting in the highest number of casualties since the shipyard expulsions of the previous summer. Enlarged IRA and Loyalist forces led to a renewed confrontation in late November. Bombs were thrown into trams, carrying shipyard workers home, killing 8 and wounding 9 others. And here's an artist's impression of a tram in Belfast, with passengers crouching, lights out, and windows wired against bombs. On 14th of January 1922, Dan Hogan was one of several Gaelic footballers from Monaghan, arrested by the specials in Dromore in County Tyrone. They were on their way to the GA's Ulster Senior Football Final in Derry City, where they also intended to rescue 3 men under death sentence in Derry Jail. The arrest prompted Collins to order a major IRA incursion across the border into the counties of Tyrone and Fermanagh on the night of 7th, 8th of February. Some 40 prominent loyalists were seized and taken south. The kidnapped loyalists were held as hostages until the Derry jail and football prisoners were released. The kidnappings caused uproar in the unionist community. The Northern government subsequently bolstered the border areas with many more specials. The roads crossing into the Free State were then made impassable by blowing up bridges or digging trenches, and were covered by constabulary posts. Only the main roads were left open, and on these there were permanent roadblocks. After a skirmish at Clones railway station in County Monaghan, which led to the deaths of 4 specials and many more wounded and captured, violence erupted in Belfast, resulting in 34 people being killed between the 13th and 15th of February. One of the incidents that occurred then was one of the most horrific of all that occurred during those 2 years of violence in Belfast, when in Weaver Street off York Road in North Belfast, a grenade was thrown at a group of Catholic children playing. 2 died instantly and 4 more subsequently died from their wounds. Between February 11th and the end of March, 51 Catholics were killed, with 115 wounded, and 32 Protestants were killed, with 86 wounded. The most notorious incident of March was the Mcmahon murders of 24th of March. After the IRA killed two specials on the 23rd of March, the home of Owen Mcmahon, a Catholic publican, was attacked early the next morning, where all of the male members in the house were shot, resulting in 6 deaths. And here are some images relating to that. In retaliation, on 31st of March, a bomb was thrown into the home of Francis Donnelly, a Protestant on Brown Street, severely wounding him and his 2 daughters. His 2 boys, aged 12 and 2, died from their injuries. One of the most identifiable consequences of partition was the forced displacement of people, those on the wrong side of the border. Many moved to Scotland and England. Others relocated to towns along the border, such as Dundalk. Dublin saw large numbers of refugees arrive throughout the first half of 1922. And here's a young Belfast refugee outside Marlborough Hall in Glasnevin in Dublin. It would be an exaggeration to suggest that Northern Ireland was in peril of going out of existence during the height of the IRA attacks on its territory. It was beleaguered though, and the British government was tired of the crippling costs of maintaining such a large and one-sided security apparatus. Even though the Northern government controlled the Special Constabulary, the British government financed it with vast sums of money. The Royal Irish Constabulary was formally disbanded in May 1922 and replaced by the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the RUC, in the beginning of June as the North's new regular police force. Whilst the specials remained exclusively Protestant in composition, in the end Catholics comprised 1/6 of the numbers of the RUC, not 1/3 as allocated. No attempt was made to increase this proportion, and by the late 1960s, Catholics only made up 10% of the RUC. The Northern Offensive of May 1922 transpired to be the last military attempt by the Free State to destabilise the North. It involved pro- and anti-treaty troops from all over the island. Belfast was engulfed in dozens of serious fires. Railway stations and mills were destroyed. By the end of June, support from the south had ceased though, and the supply of men and arms had dried up. The Civil War had begun. The northern divisions of the IRA were disbanded, many moving south to join the Free State Army. One of the primary reasons for the move south was the large-scale enforcement of the Special Powers Act after the assassination of an MP, W.J. Twaddle, on 22nd of May. Twaddle was shot dead on the way to his outfitter's shop. The Northern government then ordered the roundup of some 500 Sinn Féin sympathisers. 300 of them were interned on board the Argenta, a converted cargo vessel transformed to a prison ship. The response from the authorities was ferocious. Leading IRA member in Belfast, Seamus Woods, reported, "The enemy are continually raiding and arresting. The heavy sentences, and particularly the flogging, making the civilians very loath to keep wanted men or arms." The IRA in the north retreated. Nothing demonstrated the complexity of creating a jurisdiction from scratch, arguably more so than the law. Under the Government of Ireland Act 1920, the judiciary of Ireland was divided into 2 judiciaries, north and south. There was also a counter system of justice in place, the Republican or Dáil courts, when Ireland was partitioned. Whilst the Free State was presented with most aspects of a functioning legal system, Northern Ireland was faced with the gargantuan task of creating a whole new justice system for a new entity. The Government of Ireland Act had practically severed the Bar of Ireland into 2 bodies, but all the then existing members of the Bar had the right of audience in both areas of Ireland preserved to them. One of those was Frances Kyle, the first woman to be called to the Irish Bar in November 1921. Kyle was immediately followed by Avril Deverill on the same day. Both women made headlines around the world for being the first women to be called to the bar in Britain or Ireland. The day was also the first call of a divided Irish bar. Kyle, originally from Belfast, pursued her professional career in Northern Ireland, whilst Deverill from Greystones in County Wicklow pursued her career in the south. Kyle, like all other students from Northern Ireland at the time, still had to study at King's Inns in Dublin to qualify as a barrister. This arrangement continued until 1925. Reconciling 2 distinct political and judicial entities under the King's Inns umbrella proved difficult, and strains started to show. The Northern Committee of King's Inns was irked that some in the South were exempt from taking examination for war service, as the war service in question was in some cases in the forces opposed to the Crown. Those exempted included Kevin O'Higgins, Minister for Justice in the Free State. King's Inns ignored the Northern Committee's threats to leave and even inflamed the situation by proposing that Irish should be a compulsory language for a call to the Irish Bar. The Northern Bar decided to sever connections and subsequently established an Inns of Court of Northern Ireland, which was inaugurated at the Belfast Law Courts on 11th of January 1926. The main common link between both Irish justice systems was now broken. The partition of Ireland coincided with prolonged periods of economic stagnation and decline for both Irish jurisdictions. During the interwar period, economic depression prevailed, forcing thousands into unemployment and emigration. Northern Ireland was hard hit by recessions in its traditional industries, shipbuilding, linen, and agriculture. For the linen industry, this decline was permanent. There was little effort to cooperate economically with each other during this period. Iterations of Sinn Féin introduced measures that guaranteed a divergence between both jurisdictions on trade, with its Belfast boycott campaign from 1920 and the Irish Free State's introduction of customs barriers in 1923. The expulsions of Catholic workers and the sectarian violence in the North saw Sinn Féin make one of its first decisions directly relating to the North. It started a boycott of goods from Belfast and a withdrawal of funds from Belfast-based banks. In reality, the boycott soon extended to other businesses and farming and beyond Belfast too. Many saw it as an anti-partitionist move, a way to show that Northern Ireland could not survive without the rest of Ireland. Sinn Féin was assisted by the Irish Trades Union Congress, the ITUC, in the boycott's enforcement, a sign seen by many in the North of the complete subservience of the Labour Party in Ireland to Sinn Féin. The boycott involved members of the IRA intercepting and destroying products that originated in the Northeast, and Southern traders were banned from doing business with their Northern counterparts. To prevent goods from entering regions, trains were raided by the IRA. Sinn Féin claimed the boycott was achieving results. Many wholesale firms declared they were badly hit, losing 75% of their trade outside of Ulster. Northern salespeople on the road frequently returned with no orders. Joseph McDonagh, the boycott director, boasted that except in Antrim and Down, it was impossible for a Belfast merchant to sell as much as a bootlace in any other part of Ireland. Ulster traders responded by forming a group, the Ulster Traders Defence Association, to impose a counter boycott, claiming the boycott is at present being carried out more bitterly than ever. Ulster people were urged not to buy any southern goods, clothing, meat, butter, biscuits, furniture, stout and whisky. With the start of the Civil War in the South, the enforcement of the boycott became even more uneven and sporadic, eventually petering out. Its legacy of driving a psychological wedge between North and South continued far longer. Economically, the boycott had a negative impact on trade in Belfast and other areas in the north of Ireland. In all probability, Belfast trade with the South never recovered to its pre-boycott level, halved by 1924. The boycott also had a negative economic effect on those imposing it, resulting in goods costing more to the consumer and diminished profits for traders. Northern-based banks, such as Ulster Bank, obviously much in the news these days, Northern Bank and Belfast Bank, saw business reduced, with deposits down and some sub-branches having to close in the south. Here's an Ulster Bank building in Watford. The Belfast Bank lost 1/5 of its deposits outside of Northern Ireland and decided to close all of its southern branches in 1923. The boycott had minimal impact on its three main industries though, agriculture, shipbuilding and linen, as they mainly supplied to international markets. Ernest Blythe claimed the boycott would threaten the northern shipbuilding industry no more than a summer shower would threaten Cave Hill. Whilst its economic effects to hamper trade in Belfast met with mixed results, the boycott's aim to unify Ireland was an unmitigated disaster. It resulted in further psychological and physical divisions between North and South, some that had never existed before. Another step by the Free State government in March 1923 had arguably the biggest impact in cementing partition, the imposition of customs duties on imported goods. The creation of a customs barrier was key in translating partition into a reality. It did so in a bid to achieve fiscal independence from Britain and to generate revenue for the Exchequer. It was also an attempt to apply economic pressure on the nascent Northern Ireland jurisdiction. In announcing the imposition, the government stated that pending a decision as to the future boundary line, a temporary frontier would be placed along the boundary line between the 6 northern and 26 southern counties. This temporary frontier on imported goods lasted for over 70 years, only rescinded due to the introduction of the single market throughout the European Union in 1993. Businesses, trade associations, and charities were all impacted by the partition of Ireland. The largest industry in Ireland, agriculture, had worked effectively under an All Ireland Agriculture Department before partition. Even though the department was divided, responsibility for fisheries and the administration of the Diseases of Animal Acts were reserved for the Council of Ireland under the Government of Ireland Act. The department was a particularly complex one, making it extremely difficult to divide. According to the department, there were examples where the staffs are not interchangeable, in some instances consisting of one specialist only. By and large, problems were overcome, and both departments, North and South, did learn to cooperate with each other in areas of common interest, such as disease control. In a rare occurrence, both agriculture ministers met in 1926 to discuss areas of common concern. A particular aspect of partition in Ireland, compared to other divided jurisdictions, is the number of organisations who have chosen to ignore it. Many businesses, trade, and charity groups formed before 1921 remained All Ireland bodies, including unionist leaning ones. There was no compunction or obligation for most organisations to follow suit once the new international frontier was created with the partition of Ireland. With the confusing nature of partition, the uncertainty surrounding its viability, it is with little wonder that most bodies remained All Ireland entities. Retaining All Ireland structures was also a feature within many sporting bodies, trade unions, and religious organisations. The spectre of partition posed vast problems and some opportunities for the Catholic Church and the main Protestant denominations. With the partition of Ireland, the Catholic Church saw itself receiving the best and worst of outcomes with the creation of both jurisdictions. It went on to exert huge control over the Irish Free State on the one hand, and became the main voice for the significant but powerless minority in Northern Ireland on the other. There was never a question of the Catholic Church dividing itself along partitionist lines. It remained an All Ireland body. The primate of All Ireland was the Archbishop of Armagh, and as a body, the whole hierarchy in Ireland met regularly. In fact, of all organisations that were All Ireland bodies before partition, religious ones had the highest number that remained so afterwards. With the partitioning of Ireland, the three main Protestant denominations retained their All Ireland structures. In 1920, the primate of the Church of Ireland, Charles Frederick Darcy, emphatically declared that he did not believe that the creation of an administrative boundary would lead to a corresponding division in the Church. If it did, he said, it would be proof of a very feeble flickering life in the Church. Even though the majority of Church of Ireland members resided in Northern Ireland, the machinery of the Church remained largely based in the South. The one religion in Ireland that saw the greatest institutional changes due to partition was Judaism. It was no longer organised on an All Ireland basis. Both Northern Ireland and the Irish Free State were able to show greater scope for separate expressions of how education was to be run in a divided rather than a united country. Such separate expressions were clearly demonstrated in the very different approaches taken on education within both jurisdictions. Whereas Northern Ireland, with Lord Londonderry as Minister of Education, introduced wide-ranging changes that essentially sought to democratise education, the South imposed minimal structural reforms, but fundamentally changed the education system in its attempt to Gaelicise Ireland. The divergence in paths was also clearly illustrated by the obstructionist tactics of the South, who refused to recognise the Northern jurisdiction, and the failure of both entities to cooperate on areas of common interest, such as teacher training and examinations. The labour movement was also faced with many challenges when the country was partitioned. The movement included a divergent group of people who had to operate under enormous sectarian and political pressures. Belfast Labour candidates who ran as independents in the 1921 election to the Northern Ireland Parliament folded their campaign once loyalists prevented them from holding an election rally in the Ulster Hall. The Irish Labour movement was not a homogeneous group, with many Protestants and Catholics, Unionists and Nationalists, as well as Socialist Internationalists. A delicate juggling act was required within the political party and the trade unions after the onset of partition. The labour movement in the north sought to avoid contention and remain united by focusing on labour and trade union issues, on wages and conditions for workers. With a mainly Protestant anti-unionist leadership and a mainly Protestant unionist membership, mutually dependent for their bread and butter, but otherwise at odds, they found themselves walking a tight line between their organisational interests and the politics of their members. Some involved in the Belfast Labour Party, like William Mcmahon, sought to move further away from the British Labour Party, whilst others such as Sam Kyle, Hugh Gemmell and Harry Midgley concentrated on supplying a non-sectarian opposition to the governing unionists, with British Labour as their model and ideological base. The issues of social reform kept them united. With such divergent views on partition, the topic was avoided as often as possible. The ITUC remained an All-Ireland body, primarily because there was no feasible alternative in the north and residual interest in forming an Ulster Trades Union Congress. William O'Brien, General Secretary of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, emphasised in 1925 the fact that the working class in Ireland recognises no political or geographical border. Partition prevails almost exclusively in the political sphere. Recognising that its trade unions and members based in Northern Ireland needed to be treated differently, a Northern Ireland Committee of the ITUC was established to speak for all trade unions in the north and all trade unionists. The labour movement achieved partial union, particularly within trade unionism, by clinging to core interests within the movement and by offering a large degree of autonomy to Northern Labour activists. The complexity of the railway infrastructure and ownership within Ireland was compounded dramatically by the creation of a border. 5 railway companies were directly affected by the new border by serving both sides of it. This was further exacerbated by the Free State's decision to impose a customs barrier in 1923. Both Cosgrave and Craig agreed that the Free State would legislate for railway companies based solely in the Free State territory, and the Northern government would not look to amalgamate railway companies in Northern Ireland with British ones. Cosgrave and Craig can be seen here in 1924 with the British Labour Party's first Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald. Cross-border cooperation was harder won on the issue of fishing rights on Lough and River Foyle. Disputes over fishing on the Foyle spanned for 3 decades after partition. The disputes showed the haphazard way in which the border was drawn up. No boundary was delimited at any point for either Lough Foyle or Lough Carlingford. Nobody knew where the borderline was on various waterways straddling the border as a result. The postal services were, like the railways, a reserved service under the Government of Ireland Act. With the Anglo-Irish Treaty overriding the Government of Ireland Act for the 26 counties, the Irish Free State took control of its postal services, whilst the Imperial Parliament in Westminster retained control of the postal services for Northern Ireland. The Northern government found it very hard to assert its independence from the rest of Ireland on the issue of postal services. Its dependence on cooperating with the Free State included residents in border areas in the north being reliant on Free State post offices to deliver their mail, sensitive mail for security forces being routed through Free State post offices, and mail from Britain being delivered via the Holyhead-Dunleary route to different locales in Northern Ireland. The political partition of the island of Ireland posed problems for all sporting bodies in Ireland. The border forced all sports to look at their internal governance structures. Unlike in soccer and athletics and cycling, most Irish governing bodies managed to maintain unity by considerable compromise, as issues of political symbolism were tailored to accommodate diverse political and cultural interests. There was a readiness from many sporting bodies to incorporate inoffensive and neutral flags, such as the Four Provinces flag, and anthems and emblems to maintain unity. Great efforts were also made to democratise the internal governance structures of those sports. Most sports that remained united also did not have the identity issues faced by sports like soccer. Sports such as rugby, hockey, cricket and bowls were primarily to preserve our Protestants from the upper classes of society. The GA, as a pan-nationalist association dominated by Catholics, did little to encourage Protestant and Unionist membership. Soccer, like athletics and cycling, had to cater for different religions and classes, making it more difficult to remain united. This talk has shown how matters of state policy impacted on people and the organisations they were involved in. It is clear that there were a lot more complexity, ambiguity, and flexibility during this period than simplistic narratives of the past recall. By moving beyond looking at history from a rear-view mirror and instead focusing on the lived experience of people and organizations at the time, we can see that the political and legal partition of Ireland was not followed by a social and cultural partition. Given the piecemeal and haphazard implementation of partition, it was only natural that there would be a myriad of reactions, counter-reactions, and interactions from people and organizations. Generally, the Northern government gave no clear political direction on what path organizations themselves should take once Ireland was partitioned. Although the Northern government sought as little cooperation with the Irish Free State as possible, for pragmatic reasons, unionist politicians agreed to maintain all Ireland functions for areas such as postal services. In fact, an anomalous position existed whereby unionist politicians such as Thomas Moles and John Andrews sought as much divergence politically between North and South on the one hand, and actively sought the unity in sport on the other. Overall, organisations in Ireland were not subsumed by the iron grip of the nation state and generally chose to pursue their own paths in the interests of their members in pursuit of their own local interests. That concludes the talk. So if you, the shameless plug and all, but if you want to find out more about pretty much a lot of stuff I discussed, there's most of the topics discussed have individual chapters in my book, Birth at the Border, which you can, of course, buy at any time. So I'll hand it back to you, Shay.